Spoilers. Just so much. I have to give it up for the Russo brothers for being fantastic directors, and then the writing team, which I can't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but they did such a great job balancing that story. On top of all the other things that they had to do, they introduced T'Challa and the Black Panther thing, and I really appreciated the way that they did that. And again, Spider-Man, in a single scene, they introduced him, made him feel like he was part of the world, and justified his presence in the movie. And a few other things I have to say about Spider-Man, because it could have very easily been a gimmicky thing of like, oh yeah, Spider-Man, we got him for the Marvel movies, but I think they had a very good balance of him in the movie where you got a lot of him in a very short period of time, so it wasn't like he took over the plot, which he very easily could have because so many people were really rooting for him to be back in the Marvel Universe. Just a few other things I wanted to say about Spider-Man. I mentioned this when the trailer that included Spider-Man came out on Twitter. I was not expecting him to sound so young, but like a few minutes after watching that first trailer that he was in, I was just like, you know, I can dig it. It doesn't sound like the Spider-Man I'm familiar with, but I don't hate it. It sounds okay, and I'm interested in seeing how he plays out in the movie. In a similar way, his scene in his apartment with Tony, there were a few things about it where it's just like, my initial reaction was just like, this isn't really my Spider-Man. And by that I mean to say, like, I grew up on the Spider-Man cartoon in the 90s, and so that obviously is going to jade my interpretation of the character and my impression of the character. And like, one of the things that struck me was like, you know, I don't think I've ever like seen or heard an interpretation of Spider-Man where he actually sounded like he was from New York City. Like, he actually had like a Queens accent. It sounded like, I'm not from Queens, so I have a friend who's from Queens who could probably critique the accent. The actor, I believe, is British, so I may have to ask her about that, how well he did the Queens accent. But and that was another reason where it was sort of like another like line of divorce from the character that I'm familiar with, being familiar with the 90s TV show Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, which it's like there's two different things that's going on here. There's all the history that I have with the character as a Spider-Man fan, and then there's also the fact that I understand that they really needed to figure out a quick and easy way to differentiate the character from these previous interpretations. And again, not just justify his place in this movie, but justify the need for another interpretation of it, which we didn't necessarily need another interpretation of Spider-Man, especially so soon after the last Andrew Garfield movie. But Tom Holland, I think is the actor's name, Tom Holland, he, all of that said, his interpretation not being very similar to the ones that I'm most familiar with, and then also the fact that it was different from the other movie interpretations, like, a minute into watching him and watching that scene play out, I was totally on board. I loved it, and I loved his accent, I loved the writing of the character, and again, the fact that they were able to justify his presence not just in the Marvel Universe, not just in terms of this being yet another Spider-Man in such a short period of time, but justifying his presence in the story of the movie, which is what I was ultimately concerned about, having all these different superhero characters and how they factor into this story, which luckily the story itself is philosophically about the concept of superheroes, which sort of made it easier for them to integrate all these characters and sort of, again, justified the need to have all these different characters so that you could see it from a bunch of different perspectives. You got Tony, who's got this technology aspect to it, and he feels responsible for a lot of different things, including Ultron. You've got Cap, who's looking at it more from, well, there have been a lot of situations in the past where the government hasn't been able to handle these things, and we seem to be the best people to handle that. You've got Natasha, who, again, I felt like she was so well written in this movie. The way that she navigates the different sides and everything, and how when she initially sides with Tony, it could be seen as a betrayal, but they're like, the way they frame it, she has this line about how, like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but she's sort of acclimating to the situation. She's like, well, these are the rules now, and so we need to figure out a way to navigate them, and this may be the best way to do it for the time being. Like, she's thinking about it she's got that spy mind of, okay, I may not necessarily agree with this philosophically, but I need to figure out a way to navigate it. And so she's thinking it from a smart perspective, a holistic perspective, if you want to get into that sort of terminology, rather than just a linear perspective, which is where Steve's character is coming from for most of the movies. He's very principle-based, and that's admirable. That's to a certain extent. That's one of the things that we love about Captain America, I think, is that he has these principles that he holds to. It's similar to the way that Batman holds to certain principles in the Chris Nolan movies, like he won't kill people. Like, there's an argument to be made that sometimes those principles are arbitrary, but they are they are something to latch on, and they can be character defining, and they can also be a downfall, which again is like Captain America. When they first said that they were making movies about Captain America, I wasn't too familiar with the character. I wasn't sure how it was going to be. He could very easily just be this white knight character and kind of be a flat character, but they have done such a good job of keeping that sort of purity. Not purity is probably too strong of a word, but he has that sense of moral backbone, but also showing how that can be a weakness for him. So it's not like he's just this sort of flat, one-dimensional, oh, he's the good guy character that could very easily be just not interesting to watch. You see so often, especially in Winter Soldier, which is one of the reasons I love Winter Soldier so much, is that how do you make a sort of like Boy Scouty type character interesting? You throw him into a situation where there are tons of untrustworthy people. There are tons of things to make him question that morality, that moral backbone that he has, and put tension on that. And that continues into this movie, not in as specific as a spy fiction sense, but in just the sense that these are people that he's worked with for so long, friends he even considers, but they have a different perspective on the world than he does. And in some ways, like when it comes to a character like Black Widow, she's able to look at a situation and get this very holistic perspective on it, and think about, like, okay, there are a bunch of different variables going on here, so we shouldn't just completely disregard this proposal because it seems like it's putting chains on ourselves. And just seeing the development of that I have just so much admiration for the writers of this movie and the directors for figuring out such a good way of pacing all these different plot lines and everything. So yeah, I guess the last thing that I wanted to touch on was the fact that the overall story, like the main through line of the story, it being a Captain America movie, it's partly Steve's story, it's partly the Winter Soldier story. They did a fantastic thing with the villain of the movie by making him basically just some guy. He's a guy who lost his family in the Sokovia incident, and because of that, he wants to take the Avengers down from the inside by showing them by showing Tony that it was the Winter Soldier that killed his parents. knowing that the Winter Soldier is Bucky, Steve's best friend. And there's a lot of things that can... I'm sure that, like, there are so many discussions we could have about the logic of that part of the story and how quick Tony was to sort of just react. And again, it's difficult when you have a movie like this where there's so many things going on. There's enough there, I think, to justify the different reactions of the different characters, but I do think that because of the way that Marvel has decided to construct their movies, it did suffer a little bit by not digging in a little deeper to these characters, so that when that revelation happens, you really, really feel for Tony, and you really feel the conflict there. You feel it there in the movie the way it currently is, but it could be a little deeper if they didn't have all this other stuff that they were trying to do with the movie. So it's a criticism, but it's one that I'm not saying that, like, oh, this is a terrible movie because they didn't dig deep enough into the characters. It's still a fantastic movie. It's just the nature of the way that these movies have been made. It's difficult. And again, considering how good the movie is, I still have so much respect for them for the way that they navigated these different character plot lines. But in another sense, I just really appreciate the fact that the villain of, and I keep using air quotes for a reason, because the villain of this movie, he's not a big technological monster. He's not some fantastical creature. I talk to any of my friends, one of my biggest criticisms of the Marvel movies, and most superhero movies really, but specifically the Marvel movies and the MCU, is that the third act tends to be big fight scene. And sometimes it works, other times it doesn't really work, and in any case, they've done it so much that it becomes exhausting for me when they are putting emphasis on these big fight scenes, when really that's not the reason that I'm going to see these movies. It's cool, but ultimately I like I'm seeing the... I guess I'm sort of approaching it more from a fantasy fan perspective, just seeing the way that they explore different topics through superheroes, which can grapple with these huge archetypes and these big themes in fiction that you can't necessarily get in other media, in other genres. And so to see them and they did such, they set it up as like, oh, he's trying to get these super soldiers so that he's gonna do something big. He's trying to take down an empire, like, oh crap, he's gonna do something big. But ultimately, it's this very personal thing. Like the super soldier, the other Winter Soldiers, they're incidental. They're a way to get Tony and Cap and Bucky to this one place so that he can show them this video and tear apart the friendship that these people have developed. Specifically, the friendship between Steve and Tony, which has always been on shaky ground from the very first Avengers movie. Like, you see the dissonance between Tony, who's coming at it from this entrepreneurial, personal place, and Steve, who's coming at it from the soldier's perspective. And then you get to this to Civil War, and it's like they didn't need a ton to push them over the edge, and it's like, I have so much, like, all the praise to Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans, because they do such a great job of showing how these guys do care about each other, and they're struggling with this, and like they just, I enjoyed this movie so much. And when it came to, again, the villain, I love the fact that even after he shows the video and he sort of walks away to leave them to their own devices, there's a part of me that was still wondering, like, oh, is this just a sort of way to distract them so that he can go through with his big plan? But then you get that moment with T'Challa where he asks them, was this really all it was about? And they give the villain of the movie a very personal character moment. And they didn't necessarily need to do that. And by that I mean they didn't necessarily need to do that in a greater sense, because like they haven't done that in the other Marvel movies, and those other Marvel movies have been fine. Like the only character they really took any time to humanize was Loki, but they did. They gave the villain this very personal moment, and that to me elevated the movie beyond a lot of the other Marvel movies, where they gave him more than just this sort of typical archetypal motivation, which you can still say that revenge is a very archetypal, and I don't know if that's the right word, I apologize, a very archetypal motivation, but they made it personal and they humanized the character so that after all this, like, do I think that he should have disrupted the Avengers and possibly put the entire world at risk because he tore apart one of its biggest line of defenses against like aliens and stuff? No, not in any sense. But because they humanized, you can connect with the character, and you can sort of, even if you don't agree with it, you can sort of understand why he did it. And that's what makes it interesting. That it becomes more complex than just like, oh, this is a bad guy doing bad things because he's a bad person. And you get that question throughout the movie of like, are we really we the Avengers really the bad guys because there's so much destruction in our wake? And it was just such a beautiful way to encapsulate that, to put a bookend on that whole through line that's been going throughout the movie. And then to contrast it with the T'Challa saying he's not going to let revenge consume him, and him actually stopping the guy from killing himself. Like there's I have so much appreciation in fiction when the bullet doesn't meet its target. There are times where it can be cheap. There are times where it can be like, oh well, you just didn't want to risk killing off a character or something. I don't think that was the case. That was the case in this case. It's so much more interesting to me. And like there are so many times where you can be like, dude, if Batman just killed the Joker, then there would be so much less than so many people might be still alive. So much destruction might not have happened. I thought they did such a good job with that scene in particular of I can't even put into words specifically what it was about that I really liked, but I liked it so much. They tackled so many, they accomplished so many things that could have gone so very awry. And there are definitely criticisms to be leveled at this movie, and I will probably have criticisms of my own in the days and weeks to come, but just at the moment, I really enjoyed this movie, and I really respect all of the work that went into it, because it could have so easily gone bad, gone wrong, and they got so much stuff right. I think that whatever criticisms I have, they're not necessarily going to be illegitimate criticisms, but they're the pros of this movie, I think, outweigh the cons. And I've spoken a lot about this now, so I think I'm going to end it there. If you watched this entire video and enjoyed my rambling, then leave a comment, like, subscribe. Let me know if you want to hear more stuff like this. I really enjoyed making this, but hell if I know if you enjoyed watching it. So if you did, let me know. If you think it was dumb, or if you think that I should do something different, then let me know that too. But if you did watch this entire video, thank you for watching. Thanks.